So, animated Star Trek. What's the deal? Like I said, Lower Decks was a return for Star Trek. Its first foray into animation was the animated series, which was functionally a sequel series to TOS. Then why haven't we talked about it? Because after TNG got a couple seasons deep, they wanted to try some ideas that would have challenged the canonicity of TAS. And Paramount ultimately decided to resolve that tension by sorta kinda decanonizing it in 1989. Sorta kinda? It's basically impossible to find an authoritative black and white answer here, so here's where I'm at with it. Any parts of TAS that don't conflict with any other canonical entry, those parts are canon. The parts that do conflict are not canon, and as far as I'm concerned, only Rick Berman himself can set the record straight, if he ever does. Fair enough. But why animation for Lower Decks, though? I'm not sure that question has an authoritative answer either, but I do have a theory of my own that I think makes a lot of sense. Okay. So, like Picard, Lower Decks was created as part of Alex Kurtzman's 2018 initiative to expand the Star Trek universe. The 2D panel animation style was likely on the table for the same reasons that applied in the 1970s with TAS. Cost, speed, versatility, and flexibility. Animation allows for very different kinds of stories, and Lower Decks would be nothing if not very, very different for Star Trek. Different how? Let's start with its influences. Lower Decks is the first canonical Trek series to take direct inspiration from primarily comedic sources, some of which even lampooned Star Trek. To spearhead that, Kurtzman's production company Secret Hideout offered the job of creator to Mike McMahon, head writer on the enormously popular Cartoon Network show Rick and Morty. Yes? Sorry, Rick and Morty? Don't tell me TAS set a precedent for that level of irreverence. Well, no, obviously, but that doesn't... Oh, I just realized you don't know. Know what? Irreverence is totally compatible with being a Trekkie. You think we don't know how corny or ridiculous Star Trek shenanigans can get sometimes? I just can't think of any iterations that I would describe as tongue-in-cheek or whatever. Well, maybe not in the franchise canon, but in the fandom? Absolutely. Ever heard of a 1999 film called Galaxy Quest? Oh. Yeah, see? That film only exists because Star Trek does, and it's a riot. But you can tell it still celebrates everything Star Trek is. Another great example is that Fox Network show you mentioned a while ago, The Orville. Oh, snap. Are you changing your mind? Are we talking about The Orville? Look, I just need to acknowledge that show only exists because its creator and star, Seth MacFarlane, is also a hardcore Trekkie. Not unlike Terry Matalas, actually. In fact, he and Matalas both had in-uniform cameos on Star Trek Enterprise. But MacFarlane became famous for creating Family Guy, where the entire main cast of TNG made cameo appearances as themselves. No way! And he also created American Dad, where Patrick Stewart voices a main character, whose physical design is even modeled after him. Okay, so the roots between Star Trek and the Orville go deeper than just fandom. They do indeed. Anyway, when MacFarlane actually pitched the Orville in 2016, Discovery had already been announced. But MacFarlane anticipated that even with Star Trek officially returning to television, there would still be room for a different show to function as both a love letter to and parody of Star Trek. And he was right. While Discovery was making Trekkies question their life choices, the Orville was right there to soothe away all that tension and anxiety with tons of low-stakes laughter. As a result, it far outperformed Fox's expectations and made Trekkies everywhere sit up and pay attention. Paramount couldn't just ignore that. Love letter or not, the Orville was still competition at the end of the day. That meant Paramount had to respond to it somehow. And what better way to compete with Seth MacFarlane than to get Mike McMahon to create your next Star Trek show? That's a sentence I just said with my mouth. But how is Lower Decks, like, as a show? In a word, shameless. And I'm here for it, honestly. But it's definitely not for everyone. Even I have to be in the mood for it, you know what I mean? Say more. So, as the title suggests, we're not following senior officers here. Our 4 main protagonists are all ensigns, most of whom never even go to the bridge, to say nothing of being stationed there. And their ship ain't exactly the pride of the fleet either. They're serving on USS Cerritos, a California-class starship that is as pretty as it is important, which is to say it's neither. Cerritos is a support vessel, so it's not well armed enough for combat, not equipped enough for scientific research, and not big or fast enough for deep space exploration. So what do? Diplomacy. Specifically, second contact missions. Huh? Connect the dots. You know what first contact is. Oh. Yeah, Cerritos is the follow-up. Will you join the Federation or take your chances with other factions? If you're joining, we need to talk dues on both sides, set a timeline, schedule some meetings. Okay, and why is that worth watching? No, that's just what Cerritos is assigned, dude. This is Star Trek. They find ways to bite off more than they can chew. And when that happens, it's usually because of our 4 ensigns. Beckett Mariner, Brad Boimler, Devon Attendee, and Sam Rutherford. All of them are that tricky combination of eager and determined, but clumsy and barely competent. Each of them have their moments of brilliance, but most of the time, they're here for the shenanigans, and there's plenty of those, way more than anything Star Trek is used to. How far off the deep end are we Wait, we don't have time for that. Just give me something that sets the tone. Well, there's a ship-wide schmorgy at one point. What? Don't worry, it was a simulation, so it doesn't count. Oh, there's also a sentient holographic comm badge that evolves into a digital god. Sure, why not? Oh, the koala! The universe is balanced on the back of a giant koala! Why is he smiling? What does he know? Oh yeah, you're not actually gonna explain that one, are you? I would if I could, my boy. It's giving who cares about plausibility vibes. Yeah, which is actually more common throughout Star Trek than most people want to admit. Most of the time, plausibility issues are just covered up with Treknobabble, but with Lower Decks, they use humor instead. How do you think fans in general received the show? Well, it's definitely not as polarizing as Discovery or as predictable as Picard, so it does win fan points for being unapologetically what it is and how affectionate all of its jabs are. And now that both Discovery and Lower Decks are ending, the online slush appears a bit more grief-stricken about losing Lower Decks, at least for now. However, for those very particular fans who consider Star Trek to be some precious, noble, sacred thing, Lower Decks is a bit too irreverent and goofy for them, so the reception is definitely not as universally affirmative as it has largely been for Strange New Worlds, for example. Ooh, is that what we're going to talk about next? Actually, we do have one more animated series to cover first. This one actually is CGI, and is the first series co-produced with a collaborating studio, which would be Nickelodeon. Hold up. There's a canonical Trek show made with Nickelodeon? What, is it made for kids or something? Yes, indeed. It's called Prodigy. And to be clear, it's made for kids whose parents love Star Trek. And before you ask, yes, I have a kid. And yes, we both adore this show. Oh, I'll bet this'll be fun.